Welcome to Engage, leading conversations that matter. Join in the conversation. Send an email to engage@cfpublic.org. Send a recorded talkback message on the free Central Florida Public Media app. Leave a voicemail by calling 407-273-2300, extension 246. Engage is made possible with the support of listeners like you.
You're listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. I'm Sharon Stone. It's Tuesday, September 10th. Coming up, the remains of a U.S. soldier who died a prisoner of war during World War II are interred today at Cape Canaveral National Cemetery. The Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency explains the long journey that led Army Corporal Leo Barlosky here today. Also, a certified crisis response trainer who was dispatched from Brevard in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 reflects on the eve of the September 11th anniversary. She shares how it impacts her work today as Director of Victim Services at UCF. But first, we are hours out from a high-stakes meeting between the Democrat and Republican vying to become the next commander-in-chief. Tonight's event in Philadelphia is the second 2024 presidential debate, but the first and possibly only matchup between Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump. We have seen the impact a debate can have this season after President Biden's performance in June led to his departure from the campaign. To analyze the efficacy and impacts of debates, we asked Dr. Eric Smaw to join Engage. He coaches the Rollins College debate team. They're currently ranked number 1 in the Southeast and 12th in the nation for Ethics Bowl debating. We talked to Smaw ahead of the debate tonight to learn more about what to watch for and how you win one. First, we asked him about the similarities and differences between debating at Rollins and what we'll see and hear on the national stage.
Ethics Bowl debating is different from parliamentary debating, which is primarily what you see in presidential debates, in that teams are using ethical principles and they're using practical reasoning to try to get to the best possible solution to a problem. So an ethics bowl case will present a problem, and the problem will have ethical dimensions and practical dimensions. And the idea is that two different teams will contest one another's position over problems. So one team might be a team of utilitarians. So effectively, they will be trying to maximize the greatest amount of benefits for the greatest number of people, while another team might be Aristotelians. They'll have a virtue-based ethics, and they'll think that truth or justice or equality is the thing we should be shooting for, even if you will see some negative practical effects on the majority of people. So it might be better, for example, to have free school for everyone to go to school, even if that means for the majority of people, their taxes will go up. By contrast, presidential debating, at least how it's playing out now in America, is mostly showmanship. The goal is to show the other person is stupid, they don't understand policy, they can't speak, and many of the other pejoratives that you hear about in presidential debating, where there is no goal for solutions or there is no concession that the other side actually has a position worth considering. And it's gotten so bad in America that we've had to mute people and they don't shake hands before they debate, and the two sides don't show the American people that both sides have things that are virtuous about the position that they're arguing, and both sides have things that don't work as well about the position that they're arguing, and it's up to the American people to determine which of the two they prefer, even though both have good and bad things about them.
Dr. Smaw, do you watch debates as a voter or do you watch them as a debate coach?
Oh, this is an excellent question. It's hard for me not to watch them as a debate coach, but I don't watch them as a voter. I almost always watch them as a debate coach. So I'll read what the position is of the different candidates for office. And I think that's where you'll get an opportunity to get some substance. And then when I watch the debate, I mean, one of the things that's surprising is that they almost always go away from their policy positions when they're debating. So then as a debate coach, I'll watch them and inevitably think, well, if I were coaching the person, I would have suggested that they do this or that they do that. So that happens a lot. But it's almost difficult to watch them nowadays because there's very little substance, there's very little debating, and it's devolved into name calling and pejoratives mostly.
So what value is there to today's debate if they're supposed to provide the substance that you're saying they aren't? What should the average person take away from one now?
Yes, I think there are some things that the average person can learn from watching a debate. They could learn the disposition of the debaters. So in a few of the presidential debates, we saw that the dispositions were incredibly combative and they didn't reflect the statesmanship that we expect of politicians. So that's one thing that they could learn. And the reason why it's helpful to understand the disposition of a person, not just as a debater, but as a statesman, because there'll often be high stakes decisions that'll have to be made. And if a candidate doesn't have the right disposition, the candidate could end up overreacting to a situation. And in overreacting, they could push us into difficulties that we would not have had if they had acted with calm and reflective reasoning. So that's one good reason to watch a debate. A second good reason to watch a debate is to see, and I often look for this, whether or not candidate is willing to concede. So sometimes we'll have to make a decision under circumstances where we don't have all of the information and the decision has to be made in a timely manner. And the results of decision will sometimes be bad or wrong, or inappropriate. But what I want to know is whether or not a candidate can concede that the decision that I made was done under certain circumstances and the results were not what I intended. But now that I have all of the information that I need, we need to change course. So when you see that a candidate is able to concede, it tells you that a candidate is much more likely to change course from a bad situation to redirect us into a good situation. If a candidate is not willing to concede, it's going to be much more difficult for that person to change course, in which case we might keep going down the wrong path simply because the person that's leading us down that path can't concede that I was wrong and then change course. So I would say those are two good reasons to still watch debates.
Dr. Small, I'm wondering, when you're coaching, do you have to coach women differently than men? What I'm getting at here is kind of a double standard that exists for men and women. A strong woman might be called a certain name, whereas if a man exhibits that behavior, he might be considered authoritative.
That's exactly right. And it's frustrating to have to deal with double standards because those double standards appear in the judging. And so we have had male debaters who have argued aggressively and assertively, and they're always interpreted as knowledgeable and confident, whereas female debaters argue aggressively and assertive. They'll be interpreted as being rude and not having a good disposition for debating and so on. Especially with women, people simply have a default setting that the expectation of a woman's presentation is first, it's got to be soft and easily digestible or easily acceptable for people listening. So we even talk to women about the type of voice they use. So a woman that uses a high-pitched voice is going to be thought of as an airhead or not to be taken seriously, whereas a woman that uses a moderate tone, a lower voice without the high pitch is going to be thought of as seriously. Women in darker colors are often taken more seriously than women in lighter colors, even though they might look just as good physically in both colors. And then, of course, women are expected to smile, while men are not expected to smile. And women are not expected to say things like, that position is logically fallacious. But they're expected to say, Judge, let's consider the logical nature of the position. Whereas men can say straightforwardly, that position is logically fallacious, or you've contradicted yourself. So we spend a lot of time talking to them about that. And the other thing about it is women sometimes have a hard time adjusting because in the everyday world, girls are told, use a high-pitched voice, look pretty, be in a more submissive disposition. But in the debating world, using a high-pitched voice will simply give the judge the wrong impression of you. And being in a submissive position will give the judge the impression that the other team is winning because they're in a dominant position. So women often have a difficult time adjusting because so much of their everyday life revolves around understanding these unspoken rules about how you have to present yourself as a woman in order to be accepted. And then when they get in the debating world, I'm sure the same thing is true in the legal world or in the professorial world or in the medical world. There's an entire milieu that they have to adopt in order to be taken seriously and to be successful. And so one good thing about it is they learn a lot of that while they're here in college, and then they carry it on when they move out into the professional world.
Going into a debate, I guess there is an understanding there is disagreement on the sides. So how do you keep it from getting ugly in a personal sense? Or what do you do if it does get nasty in that way?
Yes, so we do two things. The first thing I explain to them is that with debating, both sides, if they are articulated well, will have valid justifications for why they are arguing the side that they are arguing. And then, of course, there'll be problems with both positions too, because no position is perfect, especially where you're dealing with a practical topic. And if you are attempting to convince a judge, or if you're attempting to convince an audience, it seems much more sincere to recognize that the other team has articulated really good and valid reasons for going down one path. And so on balance, one position is better than the other, but not one position is superior to the other, full stop. It's rare to have one position that's all right while the other position is all wrong. And then the second thing we teach them is to remember that you could always synthesize positions. So you could recognize that your position has some virtues and vices. The other position has virtues and vices. It might be best to reach the goal of a compromise position that takes the virtues of both positions and avoids as much as the vices as possible. But notice, in order to do that, you have to concede that the other position actually has virtues. And that helps people see that, oh, when I first came to college, I thought, okay, I am, say, pro-choice on the question of abortion, but I can see that there are really good arguments for the pro-life position, but on balance, it is that the pro-choice position is better for these various reasons. It avoids these vices that the pro-choice position can't. So that's one thing that you can do. But that also teaches them that in real life, while you might be pro-choice, you don't have to be disrespectful or completely antithetical to the pro-life position. So you could end up in a position where you very well respect the pro-life position, but you've decided that the pro-choice is the best of the two.
Dr. Eric Smaw is a professor of philosophy and director of forensics and debate at Rollins College. There's more ahead here on Engage. UCF Victim Services Director Christine Mouton looks back on supporting the survivors of the September 11th attacks on the eve of the anniversary. If you miss any part of our show today, you can always subscribe to the Engage podcast and listen whenever it's convenient for you. This program will be available on demand at cfpublic.org. You are listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. You're listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. I'm Sharon Stone. Ahead on this program, a ceremony is being held today in Titusville, commemorating Corporal Leo Barlosky, a World War II soldier who died under harrowing conditions in a Japanese POW camp.
The same prisoners who are sick and dying are the ones who are trying to care for and account for and ultimately bury the dead of those who have died. So it was an extremely horrible, horrible environment.
Later on Engage, we'll learn about Corporal Barlosky's 80-year journey from an unmarked grave in the Philippines to a military funeral in Brevard. But first, tomorrow is the anniversary of the 9/11 tragedy. As a country, we made a collective promise to never forget the events of September 11th, 2001. That morning, Christine Mouton was getting ready for a meeting of crisis responders in Titusville. Once she turned on the TV, horrified by what was happening, she knew she would be part of the response and recovery that would follow. Mouton is a certified mass casualty trainer who deployed to New Jersey in the immediate aftermath of the attack. There, she supported families whose lives were suddenly thrown into chaos. She went to the site in New York where the collapsed World Trade Center Twin Towers stood just hours before. Mouton joined Engage earlier today. We talked about her memories and work as a crisis responder to 9/11. We discussed how September 11th influenced her current work as director of UCF Victim Services. That's a division of the UCF Police Department. They provide victim advocacy support. All the staff there are crisis response trained, prepared to report to mass casualties. Mouton starts our conversation now by taking us back to the day in 2001 as the events of 9/11 unfolded.
At that time, I was working for the state attorney's office in the 18th Circuit, and I was at a meeting in Titusville, and somebody ran into the meeting and said, "Turn on the TV." And it was the early video pictures of what was happening in downtown Manhattan and other parts of the country. And we all looked at each other, and the majority of people that were around that meeting table were part of the Florida crisis response team. And so we knew at some point we would be responding. The Florida crisis response team is an affiliate of the National Organization for Victim Assistance or Victim Advocacy. And in the weeks that followed, we were tasked to respond up to New York. And the first team that I was on, we actually drove up in a van. There were 5 of us because the planes were not flying at that time. And we were actually assigned to the New Jersey Family Assistance Center, which was directly across the river from the World Trade Center site. So every day we saw the smoke. At night, we saw all the lights that was lighting up the area, the dust. It came across the river, and we were tasked with working with survivors of that event in New York and Manhattan, and also victims that were fortunate enough to be able to leave the area. And what a lot of people were not familiar with, wow, what happened at the World Trade Center themselves was devastating. The victimization surrounding that site was also very, very extensive. So Deutsche Bank, people talked about that. The hotels, all of the businesses around there were closed. People were without jobs. People that were living in close vicinity were not able to access their homes because the dust and smoke had infiltrated their apartments and homes. So they were all seeking resources. They were seeking help. And fortunately, with the help of dignitaries in the New York area and National Organization of Victim Advocacy, they were able to put together a plan really quickly and provide family assistance centers that were able to offer multiple resources in one location.
I'm thinking about you making this drive from Florida to New Jersey. How do you even prepare yourself for what you're about to encounter?
9/11 was really a one-off situation. It wasn't a hurricane. It wasn't a tornado. So we really didn't know what we would be faced with when we got there. But part of our training is you respond, and you don't know where you're going to stay. You don't know what the conditions are. It's not necessarily going to be an event where you dress up every day. It certainly wasn't. But we were fortunate. We stayed in a hotel. and we just morally supported each other on the way up. While we were there, every day we debriefed as a team. And then on the way back, just sharing, the things that really stuck out to us and, the people that we worked with while we were there.
While you were there working with people, I'm wondering, what role did you take? Are you a counselor? Are you trying to connect with services? Or is it overwhelming? Does it depend case by case basis?
It is case by case. We're not counselors. Our state crisis response team is made up of therapists, social workers, victim advocates. And so when we respond to these types of events, we are there. It's called a process. It's companioning. And when you think of, you've got multiple resources in one facility to include funeral homes, crimes compensation. For 9/11, it was also at that time expediting death certificates and other available resources. There was a nonprofit organization there writing checks to survivors who had lost a family member to be able to just go to the bank and deposit that money. The Red Cross was there, therapy services were available. Social Security was there to help families who had lost their contributor, their wage earner. If they had children, that they would be able to file a claim for Social Security to help support those children. Banking resources were there to make sure that people were not going to be scammed. Driver's License Bureau was there because a lot of personal information was debris and scattered all over the place. So people could cancel the driver's license of their deceased family member so that it couldn't be used for fraudulent purposes. And the Department of Labor was there because, as I previously said, a lot of people lost their jobs that worked around the World Trade Centers, so they had to file for unemployment. So when people came in, they mostly came in early to expedite the death certificate process because they had mortgages that had to be paid or rent now being due on an empty apartment and car loan payments, et cetera, all of those things that needed to be taken care of that require some official documentation. And so our process at that time was to go through all of the other resources that were available to them. And then that was the last place we took them so that then they didn't miss out on the other services and resources that were available to them, to include the Red Cross, who were there and paid a lot of bills for people up to 3 months. And then people were able to register for what eventually became a one-time donation because of the amount of funds that were forwarded to the Red Cross as donations. And when people left, they just felt better about being able to access all of the resources and knowing that they had at least started to take a step in a direction that hopefully eventually was going to bring them a little bit of peace. We also had a memorial wall where they could write a message either about their lost or deceased family member or a message to others about their deceased family member. And those walls are actually part of the 9/11 memorial in New York.
Everything you just mentioned is so practical. Yes, we have to do all these things. How did you, in this moment, get over the shock of and magnitude of what happened to do all these things and help these families with all of the things that you mentioned that have to be done at some point?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, we were all victims of 9/11. We all saw it or heard about it in the immediate aftermath of what happened. But as a trained crisis responder, sometimes you have to put your own feelings aside and deal with that later in order to be able to go out and effectively support other people whose tragedy was much greater than my personal tragedy and the members of our team. So we go up there or we respond to those events, and we are there to focus entirely on the person or family that we're working with and make sure they access the resources that they need, ensuring that they're okay, making sure that if they need time out from going through their situation with some of these service providers. We take care of them in that way. We make sure that they eat, that they drink, that they have time to reflect if that's what they need. They can meet with a faith-based person if they choose to, or a therapist counselor to just get some things addressed for themselves. And it can take all day sometimes, depending on the magnitude of the event and the number of resources that are available. So you get to know a lot about these individuals that you work with. And at the end of the day, when they leave, they want to give you a hug. They're very thankful that you were able to help them through that process. And that's what gets you through every day, listening to somebody's story, because you take their stories on. And so every day we have a process, it's part of our protocol, that we debrief as a team and to check in with everybody on the team to make sure that they are okay. And then we eat together, and then, we sleep and we get up and do it all over again the next day. And we do that. Depends on the response, whether a week or 2 weeks, and then a new team will come in. And once we get back to our home location, a week to 2 weeks after we get back, then we meet again, and then we have another debrief to check in and make sure that we're all coping okay and that we have good coping strategies and be able to continue our work until next time. There's always a next time.
You were taken to the site of the World Trade Center soon after. Is there a way to put into words that experience, what that was like?
We went over the river as a team, and none of us had ever been to New York. So there were some, moments that we laughed at ourselves. We didn't know we needed tokens for the bus, but the bus driver let us on for free because we were there to help out. And he took us as far down the road as he could towards the Trade Center sites. And we went down there and we were able to get to the perimeter and see it. And at that time, I mean, the dust was still in the air. You were breathing it in. You could taste it in your mouth. And we talked to people, other people that were down there. It was devastating. It was just really hard to take in the devastation. And the moment for me that really struck home was we were actually talking to a New York law enforcement officer that was kind of like standing guard on a street corner. And he said that he hadn't called his wife. He was sleeping on a cot at the station. And then he was back out at his post, and, we recommended to him to call his wife to check in with his family and let them know that he was doing okay. And he said he would do that. And as we're standing on that corner, there's this big rumble. And you kind of look around, it's like, is it an earthquake? Is another part of the building collapsed? What's going on? And this huge flatbed trailer comes passing right by us, and it has a piece of the iron structure from the World Trade Center tower. And that piece of steel girder was mashed up like tissue paper. And that was the point where I'm a visual person. I look at that and I look at my team members, and we all look the same way. And it's like, there are no more survivors. There are no more survivors. If this strong piece of steel girder that was huge is smashed up like tissue paper, there are no more survivors at that scene.
I'm struck by how vivid your memories are. You're talking to me about tasting the smoke and just the images with such detail. What is it like talking about this in the year 2024?
The memories are just like it was yesterday. It was just something that just has imprinted itself in my personal memories. And, it's one that had a lot of components to it: the sights, the sound, the taste, the smell. And not all responses are that way, but this one in particular had all of those elements. And when we left that scene, we decided we would try and navigate, the tube. And we got on the tube to go back towards the ferry so we could go across the river. And there were some people from New York that were on the tube and asking who we were because we were talking amongst ourselves. And we ended up debriefing them too while we were on the tube ride. And so everybody that we had contact with, they had their own impressions to share too, and was able to share their personal stories about how far they walked, what they saw, what they heard. And it just helped us also find context. We were there as responders, but we came after the fact. They lived through it, and that they were happy to know that people were there to help, that there were resources available that they were not aware of. And we went back across the river and we sat as a group for a minute, just really digesting what we'd seen and heard and the impact on us that has stayed with us all for the rest of our lives.
Can you talk about this as a learning experience? Were you able to bring back anything to your position as victims advocate and now later director of UCF's Victim Services?
Absolutely. Every one of these responses are a learning experience. And so what I learned from that event, I was able to help in our response to Pulse. So we were the first advocates to arrive for Pulse here in Orlando. And that experience that I had from 9/11 helped to put my team together and to be able to know what was needed for that kind of a response. And then I had the opportunity to also be on a national team again to go to Las Vegas and again, taking that experience and taking it there. But all of these opportunities have allowed me to encourage both the police department and our emergency operations center to create a crisis response plan. And you hope you have a plan and that you never have to use it. But those experiences have given me the ability to train other people, to be able to have conversations about, how this will work effectively, other agencies that may be involved or needed in this type of a response. So it's been invaluable to me in my career to have had that experience, to be able to share those lessons learned from that experience with other people and my team, and to make sure that they understand why they need to participate in that training in the event. We do get called for a hurricane disaster, or we get called to a condo collapse in South Florida. Any of those types of events require a response team of people that can empathize and be compassionate and help victims through what is for them one of the most difficult days of their lives, because all of it is unanticipated and unexpected.
Christine Mouton is director of UCF Victim Services and a certified crisis response trainer. Coming up, we'll hear the story of Corporal Leo Barlosky, a soldier who died in World War II and today is receiving a military funeral in Brevard County. You're listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. This is Engage on Central Florida Public Media. I'm Sharon Stone. A solemn and long overdue ceremony is taking place in Brevard County today. Corporal Leo J. Barlosky will be buried with full military honors at Cape Canaveral National Cemetery in Mims, more than 82 years after he died in a Japanese POW camp while serving in the Army during World War II. Originally from Audenried, a tiny rural hamlet in Pennsylvania's coal country, Barlosky enlisted at 23 before the attack on Pearl Harbor. He was stationed in the Philippines when hostilities broke out. He was captured in 1941 after the Japanese surrounded American forces following the invasion of the Bataan Peninsula. Barlosky took part in the infamous Bataan Death March, eventually arriving at the Kavabataan POW camp, where he eventually succumbed to disease. His body was buried in a mass grave at the site of the camp. 3 years after the war ended, efforts were made to identify and repatriate the remains of servicemen who died in both the European and Pacific theaters. And today, that journey ends for Corporal Barlosky on Florida's Atlantic coast. Sean Everett is the Media Relations Chief with the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency. a Department of Defense office dedicated to identifying and recovering servicemen and women who have died abroad. Everett joined Engage with Dr. Greg Kupsky, a historian with the same agency, to talk about Barlosky and the events that led to his return to the United States. We began the discussion by asking Kupsky to talk about who Leo Barlosky was.
He was, in a lot of ways, representative of his generation in the sense that he was about 23 years old when the U.S. entered the war. So, and at that time, that was actually probably a little toward the older end. But from, the perspective of most adults, this was a young kid who was sent thousands of miles from his home as part of the war effort. He actually arrived in the Philippines before the war started as part of a military buildup there. So again, prior to the war even started, he's been sent thousands of miles from home and then ends up kind of spending the rest of his life there, essentially, once the war starts fighting. So unfortunately, pretty indicative of kids of his generation, I guess you could say.
So he has bravely enlisted in the Army, stationed in the Philippines with the 7th Chemical Company Aviation. Can you talk to us about the Japanese invasion of the Bataan Peninsula?
As I mentioned, U.S. forces had been trying to build up in the Philippines mostly as a deterrent to the Japanese prior to the war starting. But as we know, on December 7th, 1941, Japanese forces launched an attack on Pearl Harbor. Later that same day, so this would be afternoon Philippines time on December 8th, Japanese forces started launching air raids against the Philippines and destroying U.S. air power, attacking military bases in the Philippines. And a few weeks later, launched a full-scale invasion of the island of Luzon, which is where the capital city of Manila was. It's where most U.S. forces were stationed. So within a few weeks, U.S. forces have withdrawn to the Bataan Peninsula to fight a holding action, essentially, knowing that there's not much prospect for being reinforced or being evacuated because of Pearl Harbor and because of Japanese advances elsewhere. So you have thousands of American soldiers and tens of thousands of Filipino soldiers fighting this holding action on the Bataan Peninsula, already low on supplies, food, medicine, and like I said, without really any opportunity to be reinforced against the Japanese forces that are invading the Philippines.
Remind our listeners of what the Bataan Death March was.
So the American and Filipino forces, they did hold out for a few months on the peninsula, but in the absence of help, in the absence of reinforcements, on April 9th, 1942, they were forced to surrender. And the U.S. headquarters at the time was on the island of Corregidor, just offshore from the Bataan Peninsula. And because the Japanese wanted to stage the invasion of that island, they needed to get these tens of thousands of prisoners off Bataan as quickly as possible. They weren't really prepared to do so. They didn't know they were going to capture this many. And again, they were in a big hurry to get these guys out of there. So what resulted was what we know as the Bataan Death March, which was the forced march of these prisoners roughly 65 miles from the peninsula to a railhead, from which they were then taken to a POW camp. And again, these guys are in really bad shape. They have been running out of medicine, running out of rations for months prior to being captured. So they're already in bad shape when this forced march starts. And unfortunately, that march would claim a lot of lives as they're being marched off the peninsula. And Corporal Barlosky was one of the individuals who was on that march into a POW camp.
And Corporal Barlosky becomes a POW at the Cabanatuan POW camp. Talk to us about the conditions in camps like that.
The camps were really horrible places. Again, the Japanese had not planned on having to provision this many prisoners, and they weren't particularly interested in improving the conditions in the camps. And so the prisoners, in the case of Cabanatuan, for example, ultimately the American prisoners who were taken there were several thousand of them. They are given some rations, but insufficient rations. They're trying to grow their own food. But again, these are guys who have been sick and starving for months. And so the death rate, especially when the camp first opened in June of 1942, was astonishingly high. You see hundreds and hundreds of prisoners dying. each month in the first few months of the camp being open. And the same prisoners who are sick and dying are the ones who are trying to care for and account for and ultimately bury the dead of those who have died. So it was an extremely horrible, horrible environment.
And like many others, Corporal Barlosky didn't live to see the liberation of the camp, and he was buried with so many other U.S. POWs.
Right. By the time he got to Cabanatuan, Corporal Barlosky was 24 years old. He only lived in the camp less than 2 months before, unfortunately, he succumbed to illness, as many others did. And his comrades buried him in the Cabanatuan Camp Cemetery.
Can you connect the efforts to identify the remains of these soldiers and talk about your contribution to the efforts of the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency, please?
One thing I always like to point out is that we are kind of building on the efforts of the prisoners themselves. The prisoners were trying to keep records, keep rosters, figure out what happened to the people who didn't make it to the camps. And then the prisoners themselves were also trying to keep track of burials, keep track of who died when, where they were buried. And as you can imagine, this was a very difficult thing to do, given the fact that the people recording this information are also in bad health. So what they ultimately had to do when the death rate was really high was bury the dead in 24-hour periods. So they would use common graves for individuals who died within the same 24-hour period. But because of their health, because of the difficulty in keeping the records, we know now that those records were not always accurate. But it did give us a starting place for trying to keep track of who was buried where within the Cabanatuan Cemetery. And over the course of the history, there were about 2,700 prisoners who died in the camp. After the war, when the camp was liberated, the Army managed to identify about 2/3 of them, but that left just under 1,000 sets of remains that were not yet identified, and left about 1,000 individuals who are believed to have died in the camp who were listed as missing because their remains could not be identified from the cemetery. And so that's where things kind of stayed until DPAA's current Cabanatuan project to identify those individuals and try to kind of sort through the rest of the puzzle and identify the rest of the dead from the camp.
Sean Everett, I want to bring you into the conversation now. Can you take us back to Corporal Barlosky being buried in Titusville? Why here?
So usually when a family decides to have their service member buried somewhere that's not that service member's original hometown, which in this case was in Pennsylvania, it's usually because either one, they want to bury them at like Arlington National Cemetery in Washington, D.C., or the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in Honolulu, or less often in the American cemetery overseas where they had been buried as an unknown. In this case, though, Corporal Barlosky's primary next of kin lives in Florida, and so she opted to have him buried near where she lives.
And why is it important to continue to identify and repatriate these remains? Just help me understand the impact on families like Corporal Barlosky's.
When a service member back then in World War II and today, when they raise their right hand and they swear to protect and defend the United States and the Constitution, the country also makes a promise to them, and which is part of today's warrior ethos, which is to never leave a fallen comrade. Sometimes because of the realities of war, especially back during World War II, it's not possible to bring them home right away. In Corporal Barlosky's case, he was buried in a common grave, and while there was an attempt to identify him, they were not able to identify him after the war. However, the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency, our entire mission is to fulfill that promise to the service member, to the service members' families, and to the nation, and bring that service member home, no matter how long it takes.
Is it ever discouraging for you that it takes so long, just we're this many generations removed?
I don't think it's discouraging because while, yes, we wish it could take less time, we're still making progress. We're still consistently finding or identifying these service members and bringing them home. They deserve to be brought home and laid to rest with their family or at a place of their family's choosing, regardless of how long it takes. So while, yes, of course, we wish that we could identify them all very quickly, find them and identify them, it's not discouraging because we're always making progress. In the time that I've been with DPAA, which I've been with DPA since 2019, I have seen the number of unknowns shrink little by little. But you know what? It's still progress. And so, yeah, it's definitely not discouraging. And then also, once you get to meet some of these families, whether it be before or after their service member has been identified, you really get a sense of why you're doing this. Yes, it is for the service member and to fulfill that promise, but at the same time, we're doing this really for the families now also, because many of these families, they either, some of them would have been keeping this service member's memory alive over the decades since they went missing. Some of them, there's either family stories that about how this person went missing and we don't really know what happened. Sometimes there's the story is more the absence of anyone in their family talking about the service member, because for the family member today, it would probably be, their grandmother or great grandmother, or potentially their mother, depending on their age, or father, not wanting to talk about the service member just because it was too painful. And so there's a little bit of generational grief that can sometimes go along with this. And so by doing what we do in finding and repatriating these service members to their families, it helps give for some families, it helps give them closure. For others, it may not give them closure, but at least it gives them answers to this sort of question mark in their family history.
Sean Everett is the Media Relations Chief, and Dr. Greg Kupsky is a historian, both with the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency. That's all for today's edition of Engage. We are back on Thursday at 3 o'clock. Just a reminder, we want to hear from you. Let us know what you'd like to hear more about, or maybe what you're glad you heard. You can send us an email to engage@cfpublic.org, or you can send us a talkback on the free Central Florida Public Media app. And there's always voicemail. Give us a call, 407-273-2300, extension 246. If you miss any part of this show today, you can always subscribe to the Engage podcast and listen when it's convenient for you. I'm Sharon Stone. Thank you for joining us. All Things Considered is coming up following NPR News.